Hey guys, thanks for joining me for another weekly video here at Soul Friend Astrology. I'm glad to get to share with you once again about what's happening. As I was getting ready for this week and looking at the transits, I started to realize there's really not much of anything extremely exciting happening, at least nothing that seems like it would necessarily derail you. But the one thing worth mentioning is Mercury's entrance into Sagittarius. And I think this will be important for those of you if you are in what we call a Mercury profection year. Which brings me to what I actually wanted to talk about with you today. I got a question on my Twitter account from Nathan who asks, "Today's my birthday. What's the most important thing to look at? My solar return chart, progressions, just the daily transits, or perfection? I'm 30, so entering a 7th house year, although that's where Mars retrograde was this summer, and ow, grimace face." Well, I'm glad that, Nathan, you survived Mars retrograde this summer. And I'm also glad you brought that question up because I think one of the important things for us to keep in mind is that not all transits hit us equally. And you bring up a very valid point, like how do you approach looking at the year ahead every year on your birthday? So I want to share a little bit about how I do it. I use solar returns coupled with annual profections. What we are doing when we're looking at a solar return chart is we are taking a snapshot of the moment the sun returns to the degree and minute of your birth chart set for your birthplace, and then that snapshot becomes thematic for the entire year. Okay? So that's part one. And then how do I figure out what to read in that part? That's where annual profections come in. And this is a really handy way to keep in mind what is actually happening for you in a given year, or what the main themes or storylines are going to be for you. The point that I'd like to make by exploring the idea of profections and solar returns and lunar returns is that different transits impact us differently. And that's one of the problems with doing individualized horoscope videos, is that everyone's going to be in different profection years. Everyone's going to be in different stages of their life. So we really, when we're doing astrological prediction, we have to contextualize what's happening in the cosmic clock to a particular situation, because you may have Saturn transiting your ascendant, threatening to cut things off and just looks like a really awful transit on paper, but Saturn may not actually be activated for you as a Time Lord or as a ruler of the year. So it just comes and goes, and maybe you cough and take a nap, and that's the extent of it, right? We have the ability to use this technology to tell our story. And so this is one of the ways that we can tell that story with more accuracy from an individual standpoint. So I wanted to share an example with you, which I think will be especially interesting if you know anything about classical music. So this is the chart of the famous Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. If you've seen the movie Fantasia by Disney, you have heard some of his music. It is really influential for the entire history of classical music in the 20th century. If you have seen the original Star Wars, a lot of the music was not quite lifted from Stravinsky, but very heavily influenced by him. And he's a really important person to know if you're interested in the history of Western music at all. So this is his nativity. It's set for June 17th, 1882, New Style, at noon in Lomonosov, Russia. Annual profections are a timing technique that you can use to determine which planet or planets are going to be the most significant components of a story for a given year. So when I'm judging a solar return chart to look ahead in the coming year, the first thing I want to do is figure out, okay, who's the most important planet? To show you an example of how this works in practice, I'm going to show you the solar return chart for Igor Stravinsky for the year that his ballet Le Sacre du Printemps, which we know in English as The Rite of Spring, premiered in Paris. Now, this is actually a really infamous story in music history because Stravinsky's music was so intense and Vaslav Nijinsky's choreography was so outside the norm that people lost their minds. It was absolutely insane, and the ballet actually flopped. They only performed it 7 times, but a few years later, Stravinsky's music for the ballet was performed in London, and it became an immediate success. People just went nuts for it a few years later. So, I want to contextualize the 30th year of Stravinsky's life. And to do that, I need to know who the ruler of the year is. So with annual profections, what we do is we start from the ascendant degree, and then we count forward 1 sign for each year of life. Imagine that the ascendant degree ticks forward 1 sign for each year of life. So when Stravinsky's born, his ascendant is at 26 degrees Virgo. When he turns 1 year old, it jumps forward to, symbolically, it jumps forward. His ascendant is always 26 degrees Virgo. But the symbolic ascendant that we're working with to predict from jumps forward to 26 Libra. When he turns 2 years old, it jumps to 26 Scorpio, and so on and so forth around the zodiac until it returns to Virgo when he turns 12. And then you just start the cycle again. So when Stravinsky turns 24, it jumps back to Virgo, 25 to Libra, 26 to Scorpio, 27 to Sagittarius, 28 to Capricorn, 29 to Aquarius, and 30 to Pisces. So that tells me that Pisces is turned on as the main sign for Stravinsky for that year. That also means anything that is placed in the Pisces will become significant. And it also means that the ruler of Pisces will become significant as well. And the ruler of Pisces, we're using traditional rulerships, the ruler of Pisces is Jupiter. And he's right up here at the tippy top of the chart. And there are some interesting things happening with this Jupiter because Jupiter in Stravinsky's natal chart rules both his 4th house of his legacy, his upbringing, his home life, and it also rules his 7th house of partnership, of one-on-one contracts, of business deals, and it also rules his quadrant 6th house of hard work, of illness, and of labor. Stravinsky's Jupiter is placed in his 10th sign. So if you're using whole sign houses, we see this Jupiter is in his 10th whole sign house, but in his quadrant chart, it is placed in his 9th house, which is associated with travel and with publication. Okay, so we've figured out that Jupiter is the ruler of the year for Stravinsky's solar return, which happens in 1912, which is the active solar return for the year that he is writing and premiering The Rite of Spring. So we want to look at Jupiter and what's happening with him in that solar return to get the story of the year. So we see Jupiter in the 1st house here at 8 degrees Sagittarius, which is pretty close to where Jupiter is right now, actually, and retrograde. So Jupiter here is really dignified, really powerful, but also kind of moving backwards. Not kind of moving backwards, is moving backwards or appearing to move backwards in the sky. Jupiter is very bright, very visible, and has a lot to say about what Stravinsky is doing. Now, we're also going to look in the solar return at the ruler of the solar return ascendant, which here is 22 degrees Scorpio. So this is Mars. Mars is going to be ruling the solar return ascendant. And if we look to, Mars is also ruling the 5th house cusp, which is associated with creative work. So this is a big year in terms of Stravinsky's creative work, publication, and it's also a big year in terms of financial boons for him because Jupiter rules the second house cusp in the solar return, and it's placed in the first and highly dignified, and also rules the fourth. This is going to be a year that Stravinsky creates a significant legacy. We also have the North Node here in Aries right on the fifth house cusp as well, so it's like the cosmos is dialing up things that are happening with Stravinsky's creative work. And if we think of the kind of music the Rite of Spring is, it's very Aries music. It's very Mars. It's very intense. And it's both Aries and Scorpionic. And I could go on and on and on about that. So we can see that this year is going to be about legacy, about Stravinsky's resources and allies. We've got his part of fortune, or the solar return part of fortune is right here on the second house cusp. And Mars has his hand on the wheel too, because he can see the ascendant from the ninth house at 12 degrees Leo. And he's also very closely connected to Jupiter in space. There's this separating trine here that we need to pay attention to as well. So Jupiter and Mars are intimately connected for this year, okay? So one more thing I want to go into is the lunar return for when the Rite of Spring is actually premiered. So when the moon comes back to its natal position, we call that a lunar return, and that's how we fine-tune things. We see here that Jupiter is once again in the fifth house, but now he's fallen. And Mars is now in Aries with the North Node on what was the fifth house cusp in the solar return. So if you know the story of the Rite of Spring, like I just said, it created a riot. And Stravinsky just left the theater completely beside himself because he was so disappointed in the crowd's reaction. But the music itself was so significant that it created a legacy for him. So we see this moon Jupiter opposition happening in the lunar return as well. That intense tension between his hopes and dreams and ideals, which have fallen into this new place, and the moon, which is his emotional security response in Cancer. So to bring this home, what we're doing is we're essentially identifying the planet that's ruling the year, and we are looking in the solar return to see what story that planet is telling. And we are looking at the individual lunar return to see when elements of that story come to the fore over the course of the year. Now, Nathan also asked about progressions and transits, and those are two other ways that you can look at what's happening. And one of the things that happens during Stravinsky's 29th and 30th year of life, when he's going through a really intensely productive phase in his creative output, is that Uranus has entered into his fifth Placidus house as Uranus is ingressing into Aquarius during that time. So there's this really disruptive influence that's happening with Stravinsky's creative work. And if we're looking just at the lunar return that's active for the premiere of the Rite of Spring, what we have is Uranus coming into the trine of Jupiter from Aquarius here. So over the couple of years preceding the premiere of the Rite of Spring, Uranus has entered into Stravinsky's fifth Placidus house and has created a lot of disruptions in terms of his creative work. Some adaptive crises where he has to figure out what kind of composer he is going to be, and he decides that he's going to be the kind of composer that writes whatever he wants and doggedly chases after what he's trying to say with each of his new works. So Nathan, that's a lot. And happy birthday again. Thanks so much for sharing that question with me. And I hope that all of y'all who watched this got something out of it in terms of how you are able to look at your solar return and your lunar return and use profections to help you tell a story. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is that when we see different techniques giving similar testimonies, whether that's a solar return and perfection and progression, whether that's solar returns and transits, whether that's solar returns in a primary direction. You've got a lot of different things that you can look at, and the more testimonies you see from these different sources, the more likely something big is, or some, maybe not air quotes big, the more likely something that you notice will happen during this year. I absolutely love answering these kinds of questions and going on this journey with you. So if there's something that you're wondering about in regards to your own chart, get in touch. Ask me a question. Let's go there. Let's figure this out. Over the next couple of weeks, I'll be traveling. So my hope is to get a couple of videos in relation to the full moon and in relation to the sun's entrance into Capricorn up in the next couple of weeks. They may not come out on Tuesdays because I've got a lot happening, but I'm not going to apologize for that because we all have our own lives, and that's okay. I'm so grateful to get to share this material with you and to go on this journey alongside you. So once again, be well.